"You shouldn't be here, Whitney. It's embarrassing." Grant's voice was low, a lethal whisper that cut through the gala's ambient jazz. He gripped his champagne flute too tightly, his eyes darting to the young, glowing woman clinging to his arm. Una, the replacement. Whitney felt the familiar sting of tears, but swallowed them down like broken glass. She opened her mouth to defend her right to exist in the same room. But before a sound could escape, the room went deadly silent. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Wyatt Harrington walked in. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at her. The silence in Whitney Rockwell's apartment was heavy, the kind that settled in the corners like dust and refused to be swept away. It had been 11 months since the divorce was finalized, 14 months since Grant Grayson had sat her down on their plush, cream-colored sofa, a sofa she had picked out, and told her he had outgrown their marriage. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't thrown things. He had been clinically, brutally efficient, treating their 10-year relationship like a failing subsidiary of his investment firm that needed to be liquidated. Whitney sat at her small, wobbly kitchen table, the surface scarred with scratches from the previous tenant. She traced the rim of her coffee mug, staring at the invitation that lay on the cheap laminate. The Aurora Gala, the St. Regis Hotel, black tie. It was a cruel joke. The Aurora Gala was the highlight of the Chicago social season, an event Grant had been trying to get an invite to for 5 years. When they were married, Whitney had spent countless nights proofreading his networking emails, ironing his shirts, and soothing his ego when the rejections came. She had been the invisible engine behind his ascent from a mid-level analyst to a junior partner. And now, here was an invitation addressed solely to Ms. Whitney Rockwell, not Mrs. Grant Grayson. Just her. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room. She stood up and walked to the window. Her new view was a brick wall and a fire escape, a stark contrast to the lake views of the penthouse Grant had kept. The divorce settlement had been brutal. Grant had hidden assets, funneled money into offshore accounts she didn't know existed, and his lawyer, a shark named Sebastian North, had painted Whitney as a non-contributing spouse because she had quit her architecture career to manage Grant's life. She was 32, working freelance graphic design gigs that barely covered the rent, and wearing clothes from 3 seasons ago. Grant, meanwhile, was plastered on the society pages with Una Oakley, a 23-year-old fitness influencer who looked like a watercolor painting, soft, blurry, and effortlessly beautiful. Whitney picked up the invitation again. The cardstock was thick, heavy, embossed with gold leaf. It felt like a weapon. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her sister, Claire. "Did you get it? Please tell me you're going. Do not let him win by hiding." Whitney typed back, "I have nothing to wear. I have no business being there." Claire's reply was instant. "Check your doorstep." Whitney frowned and walked to the front door. Sitting on the worn welcome mat was a large, flat black box tied with a silver ribbon. There was no card. She carried it inside, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a dress. It wasn't just a dress. It was a statement. It was a midnight blue velvet gown, structured and architectural, with a neckline that plunged daringly and a slit that promised danger. It was the kind of dress the old Whitney, the architect, the visionary, would have worn. She pulled it out, the fabric heavy and cool against her skin. At the bottom of the box was a small note. "Armor up." "See." Whitney smiled, but it was a fragile thing. Claire couldn't afford this. No one she knew could afford this. But as she held the dress against her body in the hallway mirror, seeing the way the dark blue made her pale skin look porcelain rather than washed out, A spark ignited in her chest. Grant expected her to disappear. He expected her to fade into the beige background of a mediocre life, a cautionary tale of a first wife left behind. He wanted her to be the ghost, haunting a life he no longer lived. Tonight, she wouldn't be a ghost. She would be a haunting. The St. Regis ballroom smelled of expensive perfume, lilies, and old money. The chandeliers overhead cast a golden, forgiving light on the guests, making the diamonds sparkle brighter and the wrinkles seem shallower. Whitney stood near the entrance, her fingers clutching her clutch so hard her knuckles turned white. The velvet dress fit her like a second skin, giving her a silhouette she hadn't recognized in years. She had swept her dark hair back into a severe, elegant bun and painted her lips a deep crimson. She looked formidable. She felt nauseous. Whitney? The voice was like a physical blow. She stiffened, slowly turning to face the one person she had hoped to avoid for at least the first hour. Grant stood there, looking dashing in a bespoke tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. But his face, that handsome, sharply jawed face she used to trace with her fingertips, was twisted in a grimace of pure annoyance. "Grant," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And then she saw her. Una. Una Oakley was clinging to Grant's arm like a decorative vine. She was wearing gold, a shimmering, diaphanous thing that left little to the imagination. She looked radiant, youthful, and completely out of place among the old money matriarchs of Chicago. "I didn't think you'd actually come," Grant said, stepping closer, instinctively boxing Whitney out, making her feel small. "Who even invited you? Did you sneak in?" "I was invited, Grant," Whitney said, lifting her chin. "Same as you." Una giggled, a light, airy sound that grated on Whitney's nerves. "Oh, Granty, is this her? The first one?" "The first one," as if she were a prototype, a draft. "Una, hush," Grant said, though his tone lacked any real reprimand. He turned his cold blue eyes back to Whitney. "Look, Whit, you look fine. But this isn't your scene anymore. These are my clients, my partners. Sebastian North is here tonight. If he sees you, it's going to be awkward. You know how he feels about loose ends." "I'm not a loose end," Whitney said, anger finally piercing through the anxiety. "I'm a person." "You're a distraction," Grant snapped, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper. "You're living in a studio apartment in Logan Square, Whitney. You're wearing a dress you probably rented. You don't belong in this room, and everyone knows it. Do yourself a favor and leave before you embarrass yourself. Before you embarrass me." He looked at her with such profound pity, mixed with disgust, that Whitney felt her knees wobble. For a second, she believed him. He was the successful partner at a hedge fund. She was the discarded wife, starting over from zero. The power imbalance was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She started, her resolve crumbling. "Just go," Grant said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as he turned back to Una, who was busy checking her reflection in a spoon. "Come on, babe. I see Sebastian over by the bar." They turned their backs on her. Just like that. Dismissed. Erased. Whitney took a step back, her vision blurring. The fight drained out of her. She turned toward the exit, the heavy velvet of her dress feeling suddenly like a shroud. She had been foolish to come. Armor or not, you couldn't fight a tank with a sewing needle. She reached for the door handle, ready to flee back to her silent apartment and her brick wall view. But the door didn't open. Instead, the double doors at the main entrance, the grand ones reserved for VIPs, swung inward with a heavy, momentous boom. The hush that fell over the ballroom was instant and unnatural. It started at the front and rolled back like a wave, silencing conversations, clinking glasses, and the string quartet in the corner. Whitney froze, her hand hovering over the side exit latch. She turned to see what had caused the room to stop breathing. Walking through the doors was a man who seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the air. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a build that suggested he chopped wood for fun, but wore Italian suits for business. His hair was dark, touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes were dark, intelligent, and scanning the room with the precision of a predator. It was Wyatt Harrington. The Wyatt Harrington. The billionaire tech mogul who had vanished from the public eye 3 years ago after selling his AI company for $11 billion. He was a myth, a ghost story told in boardrooms. No one knew where he lived. No one knew what he was doing. And he was here. Beside Whitney, she heard Grant inhale sharply. "My God," Grant muttered, forgetting he had dismissed her. "That's Harrington. If I can get 5 minutes with him, just 5 minutes." Grant abandoned Una, stepping forward, straightening his tie, preparing his pitch. He was a shark smelling blood in the water. He pushed past people, positioning himself in Wyatt's path. Wyatt walked into the room, flanked by 2 men who looked more like military contractors than bodyguards. One of them was Asher Ellington, Wyatt's notorious fixer, a man known for destroying careers with a single phone call. The crowd parted. People like Sebastian North, men who terrified Grant, bowed their heads slightly as Wyatt passed. Grant stepped into the aisle, extending a hand, his smile practiced and desperate. "Mr. Harrington, Grant Grayson, Grayson and Partners. It is an absolute honor to—" Wyatt didn't even slow down. He didn't blink. He walked past Grant as if he were a piece of furniture, a potted plant. Grant was left with his hand extended, grasping at empty air, his smile freezing into a rictus of humiliation. Una gasped. "Granty, he ignored you." "Shut up," Grant hissed, his face turning a mottled red. Whitney watched, a strange satisfaction curling in her gut, but she needed to leave. Now, while everyone was distracted by the king's arrival, she turned the handle of the side door. "Whitney." The name rang out across the silent ballroom. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Whitney froze. She slowly turned around. Wyatt Harrington had stopped in the center of the room. He wasn't looking at the mayor. He wasn't looking at the billionaires or the socialites. He was looking directly at her, across the expanse of the polished floor. Grant looked confused. He looked from Wyatt to Whitney and back again. He must be mistaken," Grant muttered. "He probably means someone else." Wyatt began to walk again, but this time his path was deliberate. He moved straight toward Whitney, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Whitney's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew who Wyatt Harrington was, of course. Everyone did. But she had never met him. Why was he looking at her with such intensity? He stopped 2 feet in front of her. Up close, the power emanating from him was overwhelming. He smelled of cedarwood and rain. His eyes were dark, endless, and filled with an emotion she couldn't place. Was it recognition? Longing? "You tried to leave," Wyatt said, his voice deep, vibrating in her chest. Whitney stammered, conscious of every eye in the room on her. "I don't belong here." "On the contrary," Wyatt said, and his voice carried to the back of the room. "You are the only reason I am here." Grant let out a choked sound of disbelief. He stepped forward, unable to help himself. "Mr. Harrington, surely you don't know my ex-wife. She's nobody. She's a graphic designer." Wyatt's gaze snapped to Grant. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Ex-husband?" Wyatt asked, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. He looked Grant up and down, dissecting him, finding him lacking in every measurable way. "You're the fool who let her go." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Grant paled. It was complicated." Wyatt turned his back on Grant, effectively dismissing him from existence. He turned back to Whitney, his expression softening. He reached out a hand, large and scarred, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The intimacy of the gesture made the entire room gasp. "I've been looking for you, Whitney," Wyatt said softly, for her ears only. "For a very long time." Then he did the unthinkable. He didn't shake her hand. He didn't offer her a drink. Wyatt Harrington stepped into her space, one hand sliding around her waist to pull her flush against his hard body, the other cupping her jaw with a tenderness that shattered her defenses. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a polite peck. It was a claim. It was possessive, searing, and absolute. It told every man in the room, especially Grant Grayson, that this woman was under the protection of the most powerful predator in the jungle. Whitney stood frozen for a heartbeat, shock paralyzing her, before the warmth of his lips, the strength of his hold, melted something frozen deep inside her. Her hands instinctively came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the expensive fabric of his suit. When Wyatt finally pulled back, he didn't let her go. He kept his arm firmly around her waist, turning her to face the room, to face Grant. Grant stood there, his mouth slightly open, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure. Una was clutching his arm, looking terrified. Wyatt looked at Grant, his eyes cold and dead. "Gentlemen," he addressed the room, though his eyes never left Grant's terrified face. "I believe you all know Whitney, but let me reintroduce her. She is with me, and anyone who has disrespected her." He let the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Anyone who has disrespected her answers to me now." Grant Grayson, the man who had discarded her like trash, looked as if he had just seen his own executioner, and for the first time in a year, Whitney didn't feel like a ghost. She felt alive. She felt dangerous. "Shall we?" Wyatt asked her, offering his arm. Whitney looked at Grant one last time. She saw the fear, the confusion, and the sudden, sickening realization of what he had lost. She looked at Una, who was shrinking away from Grant as if failure was contagious. Whitney took Wyatt's arm. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We shall." The silence inside Wyatt Harrington's limousine was heavier than the silence in the ballroom, but it wasn't hostile. It was thick with unspoken questions. The city lights of Chicago smeared into streaks of amber and crimson against the tinted, rain-slicked windows. A blurred world that Whitney felt she had just been ejected from. She sat on the plush leather seat, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the St. Regis was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp shock. Beside her, Wyatt sat with the stillness of a statue. He hadn't spoken since he'd guided her into the car, his hand warm and firm on the small of her back, shielding her from the sudden swarm of paparazzi that had materialized like vultures. "You're shaking," he said. His voice was low, rumbling through the quiet of the cabin. "You kissed me," Whitney whispered, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. She turned to look at him. In the dim light of the passing street lamps, his profile was severe, almost cruel, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a depth that frightened her. "You don't even know me. You just claimed me. Like property." Wyatt shifted, turning his body fully toward her. "I didn't claim you like property, Whitney. I claimed you like a treasure that had been thrown in the gutter by a fool." "That doesn't explain why," she insisted, her architect's mind demanding structure, a foundation to build this madness upon. You humiliated Grant. You destroyed him in front of his entire network. He deserved worse, Wyatt said, a flash of genuine anger tightening his jaw. And as for not knowing you, you're wrong. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a document or a check. It was a sketch. A rough, charcoal sketch of a spiraling tower, organic and defying gravity, with notes scribbled in the margins in a distinct, looped handwriting. Whitney gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's the initial concept for the Helix Tower. How do you have that? That was in my private sketchbook. Grant said he lost it. Grant didn't lose it, Wyatt said darkly. He pitched it to me 3 years ago. He claimed it was his vision. He stood in my boardroom, pointed to these lines, your lines, and sold me on his genius. The realization hit Whitney like a physical blow. The Helix Tower was the project that had made Grant's career. It was the design that had won the firm the award, the bonus, the prestige. He had told her the client wanted something bold and asked for her help brainstorming. She had spent weeks up all night, pouring her soul into those sketches, only for him to tell her later that the client had gone in a different direction. He stole it, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Not of sadness, but of pure, white, hot rage. He stole it, Wyatt confirmed. But I knew. I watched him present. He knew the specs, but he didn't know the soul of the building. He couldn't answer questions about the light refraction in the atrium. He fumbled the sustainability integration. I knew he was a fraud. I just didn't know who the real artist was. Wyatt leaned closer, the scent of cedar and rain enveloping her again. It took me a year to find your name on the deeper metadata of the CAD files he sent. By then you were married, hidden away. I stepped back. I respected the ring on your finger, even if I despised the man who put it there. The car slowed, turning into the private underground entrance of a sleek, steel skyscraper in the Gold Coast district, the Harrington Spire. But then I heard about the divorce, Wyatt said softly. I heard how he left you, how he stripped you of your assets, your confidence, your name. I decided I was done respecting boundaries that he had already burned to the ground. The car stopped. The driver opened the door, but Whitney didn't move. She stared at Wyatt, seeing him not just as a savior, but as a witness. He had seen her unseen labor. He had valued her ghost when she felt invisible. "Where are we?" she asked. "Home," Wyatt said. "Or at least a place where no one looks down on you." They took a private elevator that ascended 60 stories in seconds. When the doors opened, Whitney stepped into a penthouse that was essentially a glass box floating above the city. It was breathtaking, minimalist, and masculine. But it was also cold. It lacked life. "Drink?" Wyatt offered, walking to a crystal decanter on a floating marble sideboard. "Water, please," Whitney said. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago lay spread out below her, a grid of electricity and ambition. Somewhere down there, Grant was likely spiraling. "You can't stay at your apartment tonight," Wyatt said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "The press will be camped out on your fire escape by morning. Grant's humiliation is the story of the year. They'll want a quote from the mystery woman." "I have work tomorrow," Whitney said weakly. "I have a logo design due for a pet grooming shop." Wyatt made a noise that was half laugh, half scoff. "Whitney, you designed the Helix Tower. You are not designing logos for dog shampoos anymore." He set his drink down and walked to her, stopping just inches away. The tension from the ballroom returned. But this time it was private, intimate. "Stay here," he said. "Guest suite. Asher will pick up your things tomorrow. Just give me a chance to show you what your life should have looked like." Whitney looked at the reflection of them in the glass, the billionaire and the discarded wife. It was a cliché, a fairy tale. But looking at the intensity in his eyes, she realized it was something much more dangerous. It was a partnership born of vengeance. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay." The VIP bar at the St. Regis was rapidly emptying, but Grant Grayson hadn't moved. He sat hunched over a tumbler of scotch, his tie loosened, his perfectly coiffed hair now disheveled where he had run his hands through it repeatedly. The gala continued around him, but he was a pariah. People he had known for a decade, men he played golf with, women he chaired committees with, were giving him a wide berth, as if his failure was contagious. "Granty?" Una whined, tugging on his sleeve. She had been checking her phone incessantly for the last hour. "Can we go? People are staring, and not in the good way." "Quiet, Una," Grant snapped, slamming his glass down. The sound made a passing waiter jump. "Don't talk to me like that!" Una huffed, crossing her arms. "This is your fault. You said you knew Harrington. You said he was going to invest in the fund. You looked like an idiot out there." "I said shut up!" Grant roared, turning on her. Una recoiled, her eyes widening. She had never seen Grant lose his composure. He was always the smooth, charming, controlled man who bought her Cartier bracelets and took her to Tulum. This sweating, red-faced man was a stranger. "Mr. Grayson." The voice was ice-cold. Grant froze. He slowly turned his stool to face the speaker. Sebastian North stood there. The senior partner of Grayson and Partners was a man of 60, with silver hair and eyes like flint. He held a cane, not because he needed it, but because he liked to point it at people. "Sebastian," Grant stammered, trying to stand up and swaying slightly. "Look, about tonight. Harrington he's eccentric. I can fix this." "Fix it?" Sebastian laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You can't fix a nuclear detonation, Grant. Do you have any idea what you just did? You didn't just embarrass yourself. You embarrassed the firm." Sebastian stepped closer, invading Grant's personal space. "Wyatt Harrington isn't just a billionaire. He is the market maker. If he blacklists us, we lose access to the tech buffer. We lose the sovereign wealth funds. I just received a text from the managing director of the Omega Group. They're pulling their portfolio tonight because they don't want to be associated with a firm that Harrington openly despises." Grant felt the blood drain from his face. That's an overreaction. I'll call him. I'll apologize." "You will do no such thing," Sebastian hissed. "You are toxic, Grant. You are radioactive." Sebastian looked at Una with open contempt, then back to Grant. "I warned you during the divorce. I told you that Whitney was the stable one. She was the one the wives liked. She was the one who remembered the birthdays and organized the charity drives. You traded a blue-chip asset for a volatile penny stock." Una gasped, offended, but Sebastian ignored her. "Pack your office by noon tomorrow, Grant," Sebastian said, turning away. "You're on administrative leave pending a partnership review, which is fancy talk for you're done." Grant watched him walk away. The room spun. His career, his status, his life. It was all evaporating. "Grant?" Una's voice was small. "What does that mean? What about the trip to the Amalfi Coast next week?" Grant looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time that night. He saw the shallowness in her eyes, the way she was already calculating her exit strategy. He thought of Whitney. Whitney, who had stayed up with him when he was studying for his CFA. Whitney, who had held him when his mother died. Whitney, whom he had discarded, because he thought he had leveled up. "Get out," Grant whispered. "What?" "I said get out," Grant screamed, sweeping his glass off the table. It shattered against the wall. "Go home, Una. Take an Uber. I don't care. Just leave me alone." Una scrambled back, grabbing her purse, and ran toward the exit, without looking back. Grant sat alone in the wreckage of his own making. He pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Whitney's name. He needed her. She was the only one who could fix this. She always fixed everything. If he could just explain. If he could just remind her of the 10 years they had. He dialed. It went straight to voicemail. Whitney woke up to a view of clouds. For a moment, she panicked, disoriented by the sheer brightness of the room and the impossible softness of the sheets. Then, the memories of the night before came rushing back. The gala. The kiss. The penthouse. She sat up, clutching the silk duvet to her chest. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment. On the bedside table, there was a tray with a pot of coffee, a single croissant, and a note. "Join me in the study when you're ready." W. Whitney showered in a bathroom that felt like a spa, dressed in the jeans and sweater she had worn to the gala, her only other clothes, and padded barefoot down the long glass hallway. She found Wyatt in a room that looked more like a command center than a study. Multiple monitors displayed market trends, news feeds, and architectural schematics. He was on the phone, pacing, wearing a charcoal sweater and dark jeans. He looked less like a king today, and more like a general at war. He hung up as soon as he saw her. "Good morning," he said. His eyes swept over her, checking for cracks. "Good morning," Whitney replied. She felt exposed without the armor of the velvet dress. "Thank you for the coffee, and the rescue." "It wasn't a rescue," Wyatt corrected gently. "It was an intervention." He motioned to a large drafting table in the center of the room. On it lay a massive set of blueprints. "I need to show you something," he said. Whitney walked over. She looked down at the plans. It was a cultural center, a massive complex of libraries, galleries, and performance spaces planned for the waterfront. It was ambitious. It was beautiful. "This is the Aeon project," Whitney said, recognizing it immediately. "It's been stalled for 2 years. Everyone says the funding dried up." "The funding didn't dry up," Wyatt said. "I froze it. I fired the lead architect 3 times. "Why?" "Because they kept giving me boxes," Wyatt said, his voice rising with passion. "They gave me steel cages. I want something that breathes, something that feels like hope." He looked at her intensely. "Like the Helix Tower." Whitney ran her hand over the paper. Her fingers itched for a pencil. She saw the flaws in the current design immediately. The flow was wrong. The entrance didn't invite. It blocked. "The atrium is too small," she murmured, half to herself, "and the sightlines from the gallery are blocked by these support pillars. You need to cantilever the 2nd floor, open up the throat of the building to the lake." Wyatt smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile genuinely. It transformed his face, taking 10 years off his age. "Exactly," he said. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a contract. He slid it across the table toward her. "I don't want to date you, Whitney." "Well," he paused, a dark glint in his eye. "I do. Desperately. But that can wait. What I need is for you to build this." Whitney looked at the contract. Lead architect, the Aeon project. The salary figure made her dizzy. It was enough to buy her old life back 10 times over. "I can't," she said, backing away. "I haven't practiced in 2 years. I'm rusty. My license is... I think it's still active, but..." "You are not rusty," Wyatt said firmly. "You've just been silenced. I'm handing you the megaphone. Take it." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, tears trembling in her voice. "Is this pity?" "Pity?" Wyatt laughed, a harsh sound. "Whitney, I don't invest billions on pity. I'm doing this because you are the best architect in this city, and you were robbed. I'm doing this because I want to see the look on Grant's face when he realizes that the woman he called a distraction is building the skyline he has to look at every day." The revenge. It was a powerful motivator. Whitney felt a heat rise in her chest. To build, to create, to win. "What about Grant?" she asked. "Grant called my office 6 times this morning," Wyatt said. "He's desperate. He knows he's finished, but he thinks he can get to me through you. He thinks you're weak." Wyatt stepped around the table, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight. "Prove him wrong, Whitney. Be the haunting." Whitney looked at the blueprints. She saw the lines in her head, rearranging themselves, becoming something magnificent. She looked at the contract. Then she looked at Wyatt. She picked up the pen. "I'll need full creative control," she said, her voice steadying. "You have it," Wyatt vowed, "and I want my name on the cornerstone, not Grayson and Partners. My name." "Whitney Rockwell," Wyatt agreed. She signed the paper. The scratch of the pen sounded like a sword being drawn from a sheath. Just as she finished, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was Grant again, but this time a voicemail notification popped up. Wyatt nodded at the phone. "Play it." Whitney pressed speaker. Grant's voice filled the high-tech room, sounding slurred and frantic. "Whit! Whit, please pick up! Look, I made a mistake. A huge mistake. She's nothing. She's gone. I love you, Whit. I've always loved you. You're the only one who understands me. Sebastian is trying to push me out. I need you. Please, just tell Harrington we're still close. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. I can't lose this, Whit. I can't—" The message ended with a pathetic sob. Whitney stared at the phone. A year ago, that voice would have broken her heart. Now, it just sounded like static. "He doesn't love you," Wyatt said quietly. "He loves what you did for him." "I know," Whitney said. She looked up at Wyatt, her eyes dry and clear. "I'm ready to get to work." Wyatt grinned, a wolfish, predatory grin that promised chaos for their enemies. "Then let's build an empire." But even as the triumph settled in, a notification popped up on the newsfeed on the wall. "Breaking news. ESEC investigation launched into Grayson and Partners for embezzlement. Anonymous tipper claims senior partner implicated." Whitney looked at Wyatt. "Did you do that?" Wyatt's face was unreadable. "I told you, Whitney. Anyone who disrespected you answers to me." The war hadn't just begun. Wyatt had already dropped the bomb, and Whitney was standing at ground zero, holding the detonator. 6 months later, the Chicago wind had turned biting, carrying the promise of a harsh winter. But Whitney didn't feel the cold. She stood on the steel skeleton of the Aeon Project's 2nd floor, 70 feet above the churning grey water of Lake Michigan. She wore a white hard hat with "Lead Architect" stenciled across the front, and a high-visibility vest over her cashmere coat. She wasn't just the architect. She was the commander of a $60 million symphony of steel and concrete. "Hold the pour on Sector 4, she shouted over the roar of machinery, her voice cutting through the din of jackhammers and wind. She pointed with a rolled-up set of plans toward the western edge of the structure. "The reinforcement rebar is off by 2 degrees. If we pour now, we lose the curve in the atrium. Reset it." The foreman, a burly man named Miller, who had initially looked at her with skepticism 6 months ago, didn't argue. He nodded respectfully and radioed the crew immediately. "You heard her. Reset the rebar. Ms. Rockwell wants the curve perfect." Whitney checked her watch. She had a meeting with the donor board in an hour, followed by a dinner with Wyatt. Life had become a blur of motion, purpose, and adrenaline. The days of staring at a brick wall in a studio apartment felt like they belonged to a different lifetime, a different woman. She hadn't thought about Grant Grayson in weeks, until she saw him. He was standing outside the chain-link perimeter fence, gripping the wire mesh with bare, red hands. The security guard was already moving to intercept him, but Grant wasn't shouting or causing a scene. He was just waiting. He wasn't the polished, tuxedo-wearing man from the gala. He looked hollowed out. His coat was expensive, a remnant of his old life, but it was unpressed and stained at the cuff. His hair, usually gelled to a helmet of perfection, was wind-blown and too long, curling over his collar in a way he never would have permitted before. Whitney felt a flicker of something in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was a strange, distant pity, like looking at a bird that had flown into a window. "It's okay, Miller," she said to the foreman. "I'll handle this." She walked down the temporary metal stairs, her boots ringing against the grate. As she approached the fence, she signaled the security guard to hold back but stay close. "Grant," she said. Her voice was calm, carried away by the wind. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't actually expected her to come down from her tower. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and too much scotch. "Whitney," he breathed, a cloud of vapor escaping his lips. He looked her up and down, taking in the confident stance, the expensive coat, the hard hat. You look good. Different. Stronger." "I'm busy, Grant. What do you want?" "I just wanted to talk," he said, his voice cracking. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter. "I saw the article in Architectural Digest. The Phoenix of the Lake. That's what they called you. A full 4-page spread. They didn't even mention me." "Why would they?" Whitney asked, genuinely perplexed. "You didn't design this. You didn't fight for the zoning permits. You didn't stay up for 3 nights straight, solving the load-bearing issues on the cantilever. I made you," Grant snapped, a sudden flash of his old arrogance surfacing before crumbling instantly into desperation. "I mean, we were a team. Whit, please, you have to help me. They froze my accounts. Sebastian threw me to the wolves to save the firm. I'm facing an indictment. I could go to prison, Whit. Federal prison. You embezzled client funds, Grant. You claimed my work as your own. You did those things. Sebastian didn't make you do them." "I did it for us," he pleaded, pressing his face against the wire mesh, leaving a ghost of breath on the metal, "to build a life for us. I wanted to give you the penthouse, the cars, the status. I was trying to be the man you deserved. Look, if you just talk to Harrington, ask him to drop the pressure on the DA. I can start over. We can start over. Remember Napa? Remember how good we were?" Whitney stared at him. It was truly pathetic. He still thought he could manipulate her. He still thought she was the woman who waited at home, grateful for scraps of affection, while he played God with other people's money. He was rewriting history to make himself the martyr. "There is no us, Grant," she said, her voice hard as the steel beams rising behind her. "There never was. There was just you, and the prop you used to make yourself look taller. You didn't steal for me. You stole because you felt small, and you needed to feel big." She turned to walk away, the conversation finished. "I'll tell them," Grant screamed after her, his voice turning desperate and vicious. "I'll tell the press you slept your way to this contract. I'll tell them Harrington only hired you because he wants to sleep with you. I'll ruin your reputation, Whitney. I swear to God." Whitney stopped. She didn't flinch. She turned back slowly, walking right up to the fence until she was inches from his face. She saw the fear behind the threat. "Go ahead," she said softly, her voice deadly calm. "Tell them. But know this. Wyatt Harrington didn't hire me because I'm a woman. He hired me because he knows quality, and he fired you because he knows a fraud when he sees one. The world has seen my blueprints, Grant. They know who the architect is, and they know who the thief is." She signaled the security guard. "Escort Mr. Grayson off the property. If he returns, call the police." "Whitney, don't do this! Whitney!" His screams faded into the background noise of the city as she walked back to the structure rising from the concrete. Her structure. She didn't look back. The ghost was finally gone, exorcised by her own competence. The courtroom was packed. The air was stifling, smelling of floor polish and nervous sweat. It wasn't a divorce hearing. That had been settled quietly months ago, with Wyatt's shark-like lawyers ensuring Whitney got every penny she was owed, plus interest. This was the fraud trial of State versus Grant Grayson. Whitney sat in the back row, hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Next to her, Wyatt sat with his usual stoic intensity, his hand resting protectively on her knee. He didn't need to be there. He was running a multi-billion-dollar empire. But he had cleared his schedule for 3 days straight. "You okay?" he murmured, leaning close, his shoulder brushing hers. "I just want it to be over," she whispered back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The trial had been a spectacle. The prosecution had laid out a damning paper trail, forged signatures, offshore accounts, and the humiliating revelation that Grant had been paying Una's rent with client money. But the final nail in the coffin came from the defense's own side, or rather, his former allies. The star witness was Sebastian North. The senior partner took the stand with the air of a Roman senator washing his hands of a conspiracy. To save his own skin and the firm's reputation, Sebastian laid everything bare. Mr. Grayson was ambitious, Sebastian testified, his voice dry and devoid of sympathy. But he lacked the technical talent to match his ambition. We tolerated his creative interpretations of ownership because he brought in capital. However, regarding the Helix Tower, the project that made him partner, we discovered recently during an internal audit that the metadata on the original Caddy files belonged to his wife, Whitney Rockwell. A murmur went through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Grant, sitting at the defense table, put his head in his hands. He looked smaller than Whitney had ever seen him, a man shrinking inside an ill-fitting suit. "And the embezzlement?" the prosecutor asked, pacing in front of the jury box. "He was leveraging client funds to cover personal debts," Sebastian said, looking directly at Grant with contempt. "Gambling debts, lifestyle maintenance. He was trying to buy his way into a social circle that he couldn't afford. He wanted to be Mr. Harrington, but he didn't have the discipline or the ethics." It was a total dismantling. Grant wasn't just painted as a criminal. He was exposed as a mediocrity, a man who had stolen a woman's genius to build a pedestal for himself, only to fall off it the moment she stopped propping him up. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the judge asked the foreman for the verdict. Whitney held her breath. Wyatt's grip on her knee tightened. "We find the defendant, Grant Grayson, guilty on 8 counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and securities fraud." Grant didn't cry. He just looked numb, as if his soul had left the building hours ago. As the bailiffs moved to handcuff him, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silent room, he turned and scanned the gallery, his eyes locked with Whitney's. For a moment, the room seemed to vanish. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying regret. He opened his mouth, maybe to say sorry, maybe to ask for help one last time. But Whitney just took off her sunglasses. She looked him in the eye, clear and steady. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him with the indifference of a stranger passing on the street. She denied him the satisfaction of her anger. She stood up, took Wyatt's hand, and turned her back on him. They walked out of the courtroom together. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them with a final thud, sealing the past away forever. Outside, the media circus was waiting, but Wyatt's security team cleared a path. The sun was shining, reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. The air smelled of winter, crisp and clean. "It's done," Wyatt said, helping her into the waiting car. "No," Whitney said, looking toward the waterfront, where the steel frame of the Aeon project was rising against the blue sky, catching the light like a promise. "It's just beginning." The grand opening of the Aeon Cultural Center was the event of the decade. The building was a masterpiece of glass, light, and organic curves. It didn't block the lake, it embraced it. The throat of the building, as Whitney had called it in her initial sketches, opened up to the water, creating a public plaza that was already filled with families, tourists, and art lovers. Inside, the atrium soared 10 stories high, a cathedral of modernism that felt airy and weightless. The gala inside was a far cry from the stuffy, judgmental atmosphere of the St. Regis a year ago. This was a celebration of art, of future, of resilience. There were no hushed whispers of scandal, only gasps of awe at the architecture. Whitney stood on the balcony of the atrium, looking down at the crowd. She wore a dress of shimmering silver, sharp and modern, designed by a friend she had met in art school. It was armor, yes, but it was also a celebration. She held a glass of champagne, her hand steady, her heart full. "They love it," a deep voice said behind her. Wyatt stepped up beside her. He looked devastating in a black tuxedo, but his eyes were warm, lacking the predatory edge they held for everyone else. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her, as if she were the only structure in the room worth studying. "It's not perfect," Whitney said, her critical architect's eye scanning the lines of the ceiling. "The acoustics in the South Hall are a little bright, and the light diffusion in the gallery needs adjustment in the winter months." "It's perfect," Wyatt corrected gently, "because it's yours. It has your soul." He turned her to face him, blocking out the party below. It had been 6 months of late nights, fierce debates over blueprints, and quiet dinners in the glass penthouse. They had built a partnership first, a friendship second, and something deeper underneath it all that they had both been careful not to name, terrified of breaking the fragile trust they had built. "You saved me," Whitney said suddenly, the realization hitting her fully for the first time. "That night at the St. Regis, you didn't have to. You could have just hired me quietly. You didn't have to make a scene." "I didn't save you, Whitney," Wyatt said, taking her hand and kissing the knuckles. "I just turned on the light so everyone could see what was already there. You saved yourself. You built this. I just bought the steel." "You did more than that," she said, stepping closer. She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble. "You believed in me when I had forgotten how to believe in myself." Wyatt leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief second. When he opened them, the vulnerability there took her breath away. "I have a new proposal for you." Whitney laughed, a light, free sound. "Another building? I need a vacation first, Harrington." "No," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to that rough, intimate register that made her knees weak. "Not a building. A life. I want you to be my partner. In everything. No more contracts. No more guest suites. I want you to wake up next to me every morning and tell me my tie is crooked." He reached into his pocket. No ring. That was too fast, too cliché for them. Instead, he pulled out a key. An old-fashioned, heavy iron key on a leather cord. "This is the key to my grandfather's cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains," he said. "No internet, no press, no galas, no reception, just us, for 2 weeks. Come with me." Whitney looked at the key. It wasn't a diamond. It was an invitation to intimacy, to reality. She thought of Grant, sitting in a cell, surrounded by the ruins of his false life. She thought of Una, who had vanished into obscurity, just another influencer whose filter had slipped. She thought of the woman she used to be, scared, small, hidden behind a man who dimmed her light. That woman was gone. Whitney took the key, her fingers brushing his palm. 2 weeks, she teased, arching an eyebrow. "I don't know, Harrington. That sounds like a long time to be stuck with a demanding client." Wyatt grinned, pulling her close by the waist, possessing her as he had that first night, but this time with her permission. "I promise to be on my best behavior." "I hope not," Whitney whispered, pulling him down to her. And as he kissed her, under the soaring glass arch of the building she had dreamed into existence, the applause from the crowd below faded away. Whitney Rockwell finally felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not behind a man, not beneath him, but beside him, standing tall. Whitney's journey wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclamation. She took the bricks thrown at her, the betrayal, the public humiliation, the theft of her talent, and used them to build a foundation that no one could ever shake again. Grant Grayson learned the hard way that when you treat people like stepping stones, you eventually run out of ground to stand on. And Wyatt Harrington learned that the greatest investment he could ever make wasn't in technology or stocks, but in the brilliance of a woman who just needed a chance to shine. In the end, the best revenge wasn't seeing Grant in handcuffs. It was Whitney realizing that she no longer cared enough to watch. She was too busy building the sky. Enjoyed this story? If Whitney's comeback gave you chills, hit that like button. Do you think Grant got what he deserved? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories of betrayal, revenge, and glorious redemption. See you in the next video.